the book of Hebrews chapter 3, Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Ato ang pagabasahon, kining duha ka verses, verse 12 and verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 3. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Ano ang taliha ka na mga igsoon? I trust na ato usab na mga kaigsuonan diha sa ilaha nga mga Pinoyanan has opened their Bibles also to Hebrews chapter 3, and we shall read together in unison yung ano nato sa pagbasa, verses 12 and verse 13, reading. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God, but exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Niining kagabi kahaponon mga igsoon, I'd like us to consider for our meditation this subject on exhorting one another. Exhorting one another. This has been the exhortation nga tuang nabasa from our text for consideration from Hebrews chapter 3 verses 12 to verse 13. Exhorting one another. And somehow mga kaigsunan, as we talk about this topic on exhorting one another, ako natuo that we are familiar with this, and we are so familiar with this, for we have been doing this on a day-to-day basis sa matag usa ka nato, hilabi na niining panahon nga ato ang nahimutangan. By the grace and mercies of God, we have been doing this, exhorting one another in this most trying time, in this most challenging time, in these most difficult times of our life. And somehow, mga kaigsunan, it has brought about much comfort and encouragement to one another as we commit ourselves to exhorting one another. And I want us to understand, mga kaigsunan, that this exhorting one to another and one with another is one of the many duties and responsibilities that we have for one another. Dili pa lang dugay, we have been looking at that passage of comforting one another. And we have learned at that time na diin ang Kristohanon nga pagkinabuhi is a kind of life that is all about one another. We are to love one another, we are to honor one another, we are to forgive one another, we are to pray for one another, we are to submit one to another. And in this passage, niining kahaponon, we are exhorted to what? Exhort one another. The exhortation for us niining kahaponon is to exhort one another. Now, interesting kayo mga kaigsunan, kay ang magsusuwat sa mao nga kanang sulat ngadto sa mga mga Hebrewanon, actually nagadasig kanila, warning them regarding unbelief, regarding apostasy, regarding rebellion. Mao kana ang mga pagdasig nga iyahang gisulti o gisuwat dinha. Unya, looking at verse 12, I want us to take a closer look at this verse. Kay dinhi the writer to the Hebrews is actually issuing a warning. And what is that warning all about? Ingon diha, take heed, pagbantay. That's the warning there. Pagbantay mga kaigsuonan. Ingon diha, take heed, brethren. And what is it that we are to take heed? What is it that we are being warned against? Ingon diha ang mga verse, take heed, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. You know, mga kaigsuonan, ang katuyuan dinhi sa magsusuwat mao ang pagpahinumdum sa mga kaigsuonan sa pagdili, pagbiya, sa pagdili sa pagkalikod o pagdili simang diha sa ilaha nga pagtuo. This is actually a warning against unbelief and against apostasy. Unya, somehow mga kaigsunan, as we reflect upon our life, diining atuang giatubang karon, I am sure nga makita nato ang posibilidad that any one of us can likewise give in to doubt and unbelief as we go through these difficult times. Any one of us can give in to worry and fear. Any one of us can give in to panic. And one of us can simply give in to any of these unwelcome thoughts and attitudes, and can even bring us to turning away to forsake the faith. Especially kung anaa kita diha taliwa sa mga kalisod. Gani mga kaigsunan, as we go through these trying times together, whether you like to admit it or not, it has somehow made an impact in our lives. Nga sa atuang pag-undergo niining ingon pa nato, grabe nga sitwasyon o mga pagsuway, some of us nadaog sa kalaay, some of us nadaog sa kaluya, some of us nadaog sa pagkawala sa paglaom, some of us have given unto doubts. Yes, it is true. Some of us may have even given in to what? Giving up their calling, doubting their calling. Yes, nagkalain ang epekto niining atuang giatubang karon sa tagsa-tagsa kanato, whether you like to admit it or not. Very much like in verse 12, take heed therefore, brethren, lest any be in of you with an evil heart of unbelief. Kay posible kayo na nga mahitabo ka na to. Hilabi na in these most trying times nga to ang giatubang, that we can so easily give in to what? We can so easily surrender. Muragwa naman yun ni paglaom, muragwa naman yun. You know, daghan ang musod sa ang unang-una. Yes, any one of us, regardless of unsa nagakadugay sa imuhang pagtuo, you can be subjected and you can give in to worry and fear, to doubt and unbelief, and even turn away and forsake your calling. Yes. Mo ka na tinod. Kaya sometimes we feel so good, we feel so convinced, we feel so convicted na tinawag kita sa Ginoo when everything is doing well with us. Pero kung muagi na gani og mga pagsuway, then we start to entertain doubts. Unya ka ng doubt nga itong entertain, kita pag yung magsuknot niya na. Look at verse 12. Take heed, brethren, lest there be any of you an heart of unbelief. Kaya kung ikaw na mismo magpadaog diha sa imong mga pagduwa-duwa, sa imong mga pagpangutana, na oftentimes, especially sa mga sitwasyon na kasama nini, as I often say, there are too many questions with answers that are but few. Apan kaliwa ni ining tanan mga kaigsunan, we need to take heed. That's the warning for us, right? Take heed. Brethren, lest there be in any of you a heart of unbelief. Look at this. Look at the next part. In departing. In departing. Mo-depart, mubiya. Mubiya ka na sa pagtawag sa Ginoo diha nimo. Ano man? Because you started to doubt God's calling upon your life. You depart, ug diin ka gibutang sa Ginoo. You depart. Maingon na gani kang depart, dibiya ka diha, ug manipad ka, ug mangita ka, ug asa ka, ngadto. Are we following? And sometimes we are like that. Tungod lamang kay things are not doing well and that things are working out according to our plans. Magsugod na din daw pag-unaw na, magmugna, uglain na sad nga mga mugna. Departing. Look at the word there. Departing. You know, mga kaigsunan, the moment you entertain that departing from your calling is very much like saying you are departing from God. Now, we're not talking here about apostasy nga nibiya na yung kas Ginoo apan sa imuhang pagtalikod sa pagtawag sa Ginoo diha nimo o sa imong pagtalikod sa iyang nga plano diha kanimo, you are actually expressing your what? Kind of you want to exercise your independence from God. I want to do things my way. And oftentimes, mo kanay mudangat ka na to. Hilabi na kung taas-taas ang panahon nga naatas kalisod. Sama nini nga to ang giatubang. Nga kapila ng gitagamtaman na to o gi-announce ang extension. We may have been of high hopes nga pizza 15, mahuman na yun ang insecure, and gradually things will be going back to normal, and then only to know and only to realize that it has been extended to another 2 weeks. And so what? Makapadismaya perhaps? Yes. Makapadisappoint perhaps? Yes. Kaya nga naman, we seem to have our own timetable of things. But then what? Let's face the reality and accept the fact that these things are beyond us. Nga angay siguro nga ito ang sutaon diha sa itong kagalingon ug asa na ito ilugar ang ato ang kagalingon. Yes, as the writer to the Hebrews here warns the people, take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief. You know, it's always like this. You start to doubt, and that doubt would bring you to what? Unbelief. Mamugnaw ka sa imong pagtuo. Obviously, mamugnaw ka gani sa imong pagtuo, mamugnaw ka na sa imong pagsalig. Mamugnaw ka na gani sa imong pagsalig, daw nawa na po ka, nawatan na po ka sa paglaom. Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, we are in this together. We have been trying to encourage one another. And you know what? This is what the writer to the Hebrews here is telling us to do. Nga taliwa nining hulga nga ato ang giatubang. What kind of threat? A threat that may cause us to doubt God. A threat that may cause us to stop believing in God and to question God's working and God's dealing. Some may even turn away and forsake God. With all the difficulties and dangers, mga kaigsunan, any one of us can give in to discouragement. Any one of us can be depressed, and any one of us can be in despair. That's why we need to what? Take heed. Take heed. Paminawa o dungga, bantayi ang imong kagalingon that you cannot fall into this state of unbelief. Pagbantay diha sa imong kagalingon nga di ka mahulog diha. Kaya nga naman, kaysa pagkahulog ni mo diha, look at verse 12, last part, in departing from the living God. Now, of course, we are not talking here about losing our salvation, but simply drifting away ang atong pagpahilayo sa Ginoo. Basin kung mo makalantaw niya na in that sense. Moment you entertain, yes, this is a sad reality kay niining period of ECQ. It has indeed impacted our life in different ways. Samtang ang uban ka nato nalabaw ni nalikon o nalikon pag-ayo atong pagsalig sa Ginoo, there are some of us nga murag namugnaw nawat-an sa paglao o pagtuo sa Ginoo, even to question God's calling them in the ministry. It's very sad. Because these are the things na ni-resulta diha sa ato ang mga kasing-kasing. Mao kana that I'd like us to consider this verse 13. Human sa iyahang pag-issue sa warning against unbelief, rebellion, and departing from the Lord or forsaking the Lord, the writer to the Hebrews went on to give them this exhortation. Haron nga malikayan ang pagbiya o ang pagtalikod nato diha sa atong pagtuo. Gihatagan kita niya niini nga mga pagdasig o pag-awhag diha sa bersikulo 13 nga angay nato ang pagabuhaton sa usan-usan kanato. Now, what is it that we are told in verse 13 that we are to do to one another? Look at the duty. The duty, that's the first point. Our duty here, ingon diha, but exhort one another. Kita na to? Haron nga malikayan, haron nga malikayan o mapugna nato ang pagkabugnaw nato, ang pagkawala sa itong paglaom, o ang pagkawala sa itong pagsalig nato sa Ginoo. The writer to the Hebrews is telling us to do this to one another. And what is it that we are to do to one another? Exhort one another. Mao kini atong gikinahanglan sa usa-usa nga magdinasigay ta nga atong lig-unon ang tagsa-tagsa kanato diha sa pagsalig, dili kay na discourage ang usa, imo kung duyugan ni duha na mo ma-discourage. Look at the duty there. Instead of giving in to unbelief and departing from the living God, we are to what? Exhort one another. Mga igsoon, we have this solemn duty to fulfill towards our fellow brethren. And that is to call one another, to entreat one another, to admonish one another, to urge one another, to spur one another up. Ang pagdasig nato sa usa-usa, ang pagdinasigay nato sa usa, hilabi na sa ato ang sitwasyon karon. Mas gikinahanglan nato ni siya nga dunggon o mas gikinahanglan nato ni nga atong pagabuhaton sa usa-usa kanato. And what is it that we are supposed to do to one another? Exhort one another. You know, the word exhort here can also mean to comfort, to build up, to encourage. And you know mga tigsunan, kung naman tayo kinahanglan o nga ngayon buhaton sa usa-usa kanato karon mao kana ang pagdinasigay. Kay lagi sa nagkadugay ning ato ang giatubang na COVID-19 pandemic, sa inahinay nakita nako ang mga epekto niini sa tagsa-tagsa nato. While by the grace of God, some have been strengthened all the more and become so firm in their faith, I see that it also somehow have a negative impact sa uban nato ng mga kaigsunan. Gilaay, awan sa paglaom, gimingaw, for whatever reason. That we need to do this to one another. We are to exhort one another. That is to comfort, to spur one another up, to urge one another to press on. Ang pagdinasigay, ang pag-comfort sa usa-usa. It is interesting to note, mga kaigsunan, that what we often see among people is that they bite and devour one another. Labi na kung magtanaw kita sa mga tao diha sa kalibutan, we see them biting and devouring one another, tearing one another down. Apan alam kanato nga mga anak sa Ginoo, we are told in this verse that we are to exhort one another. And that is to comfort one another, to edify one another. This is our duty to one another. Every Christian must see to it nga ato ning mahimo ug mabuhat sa usag-usa kanato. And that we would do it with gladness and with joy. Nga diin, we can build one another up. Kaya gani mga kaigsunan, even when this enhanced community quarantine nga gi-extend bago lang and up until the end of May. After the end of May, what? it is still subject for extension or for reconsideration ngayon August. Upon when it is reduced to another level or a lower level of category, it doesn't mean that life would get back to normal. Wala na magpasabot nga normal na sa ka maglaglaag. The truth of the matter is, feeling niya kung ka magpuyo sa inyong Pinoyanan kung kay lakwan, kaya man sa kayo malakwan, kay sirado man ng tindahan. Gani, ini kahumana ng kanang ECQ, going back to general common community quarantine, wala giya po biyahe. So, layo pa kay nas tinuod, umubalik nas normal ang atong mga kinabuhi. Unya, dili na itong likuno ng atong kagalingon, o di ta magdinasigay sa itong tagsa ka na ito. Now, kung ikaw, anak-anak, naana diha dapita sa unbelief and doubt, one antras paglaom, kung di yun nimo dasigon po ng imong kagalingon, kung di ko ka magpadasik sa uban, padong yun ka, dito sa kabugnaw, diha sa mong pagtuo. Guard your hearts, mga kitsunan. Without you realizing it, that is where it is leading you into. The moment you start to doubt, the moment you question God's working and dealing, is the very first step that would lead you to drifting away from God's plans and purposes diha sa imuhang kinabuhi. Be very careful. Unya, alam mo sa kanato, mo kini nga ato ang bantayan ng atong kagalingon, that we must always be ready to encourage one another. And again, ako mapasalamaton nga kining gitawag nato og exhorting one another, kanunay nato gibuhat o kanunay nato makita diha sa ato ang mga kaigsunan who are active and visible in our group messaging. Nga diin, we seek to decide to encourage one another, building one another up. Gani nindot pa kayo nga diha mga higayon nga sometimes when the flow of the conversation may not be that edifying, one sister or another brother may bring up to that attention and admonish, because exhorting one another also would include admonishing one another. Nga magiyahan kita, nga mupadayon ta diha sa husto nga dalan. And you know what? If you are able to do it to one another, you are fulfilling the solemn and sacred duty in which we are encouraged and exhorted to doing to one another. Ingon niya, exhort one another. That is our duty. Now, moving on, looking at the middle part of verse 13, I want us to see the frequency of that duty. How often would you do that duty to one another? How often would you do that exhorting one another? Look on. But exhort one another what? Daily. Can you see that in verse 13? Exhort one another daily. You are supposed to do this exhorting of one another on a regular basis. Again, I have been saying it, and I want to say it again, moni ako ang usa ka kanang mapasalamatan sa Ginoo, because I realize nga niining panahon na it seems like the Lord has enabled me to minister to each and every one of you, not just on Sundays, not just on Wednesdays, not just when we gather together for fellowship meetings, not just when we meet together, but even on a day-to-day basis by sharing with you my morning devotion. Because that, in a way, we are fulfilling this duty of exhorting one another. Look at the verse. But exhort one another, what? Daily. Unsa man daily? Kada adlaw, sa matag adlaw sa atong kinabuhi, gani ni padayon ang mga verse. But exhort one another daily while it is called today. Simply means while it is in the present time. The emphasis there is to what? That consciousness and that awareness na sa matag adlaw sa imong kinabuhi. As much as possible, see to it that you are able to exhort one another. It means you don't allow a day to pass on to your life na wa ka makadasig sa imong isig ka. Ingon. Exhort one another daily while it is called today. In other words, ayaw tuguti nga mulabay ang usa ka adlaw sa imong kinabuhi mga kaigsunan, nga wa ka makadasig sa imong isip ka, ingon. Exhorting one another is one duty that we all must do on a daily basis. Ganit sa pag-ingon diha nga daily mga kaigsunan, wa na nagpasabot nga you are to exhort one another daily. Wa na nagpasabot nga maka-exhort, makadasig lang kag kausa, okay na. No. Let it be nga every day of your life you would have and you would seize every opportunity to exhort one another. It must be done constantly. It must be done consistently with a kind of awareness that we all need it. Kitang tanan nang kinahanglan ana, kinahanglan tang mudasig o kita kinahanglan usab dasigon sa uban. Mutual nga pagdinasigay. Ang uban ng hinahanglan sa atong mga pagdasig sa mga kita ng hinahanglan sa ilaha nga pagdasig. Yes, it must be done constantly and consistently with a kind of awareness that we all need it. And we must seize every opportunity to exhort one another. Look at this. Daily. Sa kada adlaw. Again, if we are to do it on a regular basis, in normal times, labaw na karon ining panahon nga ito ang himutangan, labaw na karon ining panahon nga ito ang atuang nga diatubang, that we all are exposed to this most challenging of all times at atuang kinabuhi, labaw na kinahanglan nato nga magdinasigay sa usa-usa. For any one of us can work out your way. Things doesn't work out according to your expectation. This year 2020, this is what I want to accomplish in my life. Ayaw mga kaibigan. Ayaw pagpadala. Underline verse 12. Take heed, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief. You know mga kaibigan, not every Christian is able to discern. Gracias sa Ginoo, if pastors and mature Christians can lead you. We all can succumb to doubt, we all can succumb to unbelief, we all can succumb to questioning God's calling upon our lives. It's but natural, labi na ulit na magminampingon sa itong pagkinabuhi. But by the grace of God, anahin mga tao, na gamiton sa Ginoo para hinumdum kaninyo nga makita ninyo ang mas clearer and the bigger and the wider picture of all things, you be able to discern bitaw. Yes, we are to exhort one another daily. Again, pila binamining kahintang nato karon, meaning sitwasyon nga ato ang giatubang karon. In fact, if you are familiar with the Lord Jesus' Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, in that portion when his disciples asked him, well, when will be the end of the world? Kunya, gisay-say niya, there will be wars, pestilence, famines, rumors of wars, nation against nation. Kunya, ingon niya siya, all these are but the beginning of sorrows. That is what he said in verse 8. All these are but the beginning of sorrows. Unya, kining ato ang giatubang karon. Is this not part of the beginning of sorrows? Nga kung dili kita mag-amping sa itong kagalingon, kung di nato likunon ang atong kagalingon, kung dili nato dasigon ang atong kagalingon, we can succumb to doubt and unbelief. As a church, as a body of believers, and as a household of faith, this is our duty to one another, and we must endeavor to be active in doing and fulfilling this duty to one another. Remember the duty? Exhort one another. And the frequency in doing that duty, exhort one another daily. Sa matag adlaw, sa kada adlaw, every moment of it, as and when there be opportunities, let us exhort one another. Mabitaw ka na mga kaigsunan, nga diha sa itong group messaging, of course, we need to be conscious kung unsa po ang atong ipangbutang diha. Nga ato agad nga siguruhon nga kining ato ang ipangbutang diha, o nga atong itinguha, nga atong i-share diha, maka-exhort sa ato ang mga kaigsunan. And thus far, mga kaigsunan, by God's grace, that is what we have been seeing, that is what we have been experiencing, nga sa kada buntag, kada bukukaw, kada mata, unya diha nga ako ang ibutang na diha ang ato ang devotion. Some even would be earlier, nga they would share their own verses for the day. Yes, it's good. Because that is our duty to one another. Dili lang kay ako share diha og verse. Many of you are also doing so. So, sa inyo hang gi-share, I'm also minister. Because it is our duty to one another. It's not just the pastor's duty to the congregation. It's also the congregation's duty to the pastor. Mutual. Yes, we may differ in our functions. Diha sa simbahan, there are leaders in the church, elders, deacons, we have pastors, we have preachers, we have missionaries, and the rest are church members. Yes, true. Well, that's the truth of the matter. We are many parts of one body, and many parts of one body, we are to complement one another. Ang pagdinasigali sa usan-usan. And you know, mga kaigsunan, the writer to the Hebrews indeed has written quite a lot on this matter. Now, later on in Hebrews chapter 10, turn your Bibles there for a while. In Hebrews chapter 10, the writer to the Hebrews continued to exhort us on this matter, on this subject of exhorting one another. Turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. And look here, Hebrews chapter 10, unya tanawa ang verse 23. Tanawa ang mga pagdasig diha. Gani, gasugod na siya sa verse 22, let us. So, mingon gani kag let us, gidasig nimo ang tanan. Gidasig nimo ang mga kaigsunan, let us. Hali. Gidapit nimo ang uban. Then look at verse 23. Let us what? Hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. So, gidasig ka diha. Gidasig ka sa pag-unsa. Sa paglikon diha sa imuhang pagtuo nga sa way paglubad o pagway pagkabahar. You know, mga kaigsunan, in difficult and trying times in our life, it is when we can so easily give in to entertaining doubts. And the moment we entertain doubts is the same moment that our faith begins to waver. That we start to entertain questions. We start to entertain doubts. And who are we doubting? Of all people, God. Pwede siguro ka, o makasabot na siguro ka, tao, you try to doubt a certain person in view of what he said, in view of what he promised. But I cannot imagine we, God's people, saved by His grace and mercy, would start to doubt Him and doubt His calling upon us. Look at verse 22. Verse 23. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. Look at the next part inside the parenthesis. For He is what? He is what? According to the verse. He is faithful, the promised. Sa atong tawhanon nga mga sitwasyon o sa kahimtang nagi panahon nga mapildi ta o madaog kita sa ato ang tawhanon nga emosyon o mga pagbati o panglantaw sa mga panghitabo. And sometimes kini nga mga panglantaw magdala ka nato diha sa ato ang mga kaluyakon that we start to entertain now. I hope none of us are given into such a condition that if there be any of us, mga kaigsunan, who may have given in to that doubt and may have started to waver in the faith, may this day and this hour, hearing this message, encourage your heart to come back to the Lord. Lord, sorry kayo na I doubted your calling and your plans and purposes sa kuwang kinabuhi. Sorry kayo that I doubted and I wavered sa kuwang pagtuog, pagsalig diha kanimo. You have brought me this far. Karon na lang ko mo doubt, mo question sa imong leading o sa imong mga plano sa kong kinabuhi. You know, mga dictionary is very serious. That we need to be encouraged by God's word. Now, sa ingon diha, let us what? Hold fast. Kupti o hukti pag ayaw na nimong gihuktan na pagtuo. O ayaw pagluya, pagkupot niya na. Ayaw kawa sa paglaom nga diha sa pagkawa sa paglaom, magluya ka, mamuypoy ka, nga murag daw mubati na ka, o kakapoy nga mubuhi ka na diha sa imong gihuktan na pagtuo. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. Kaya nga naman, for He is faithful that promised. Now, I'll bring you to another passage, mga kaigsunan, talking about the faithfulness of the one who promised is the same faithfulness of the one who called you. Turn with me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 24. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 24. He is faithful that promised. And look at what it says here. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 24. Faithful is He that calleth you, who also will do it. Yes. It is just sad that at times we succumb to our doubts and fears that can bring us to some kind of unbelief on our part. If you happen to be in that condition and situation, karon ining tungura mga kaigsunan, pray in your heart, Lord, dasikan ko diha sa imong puso. Dat ako diha sa hingpit nga pagtuog, pagsalig kanimo. Now, the writer to the Hebrews goes on. Now, balik ta sa Hebrews 10. Verse 23, let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for He is faithful that promised. And look now at verse 24, another exhortation. And let us consider one another. Consider one another. Let's think of how we can reach out to one another and to do what? Look on. And to provoke. Now, interesting ka ng word na provoke. Kaya ng word na provoke is actually to stir up one another. But oftentimes, especially sa atong kinabuhi o sa atong panahon, the word provoke is used in the negative sense. You are being provoked to anger. You are being provoked to wrath. Upon dinhi, we are supposed to provoke one another unto love. In other words, it is an active act of encouraging one another to the point that we are able to provoke kanang makapaulbo kasi mong isig kayon diha sa pagbuhat sa maayo. The people in the world and the people in our time is familiar with provoking one another to anger. Nga magkaaway na inyo sila kay mapasuko. Apan dinhi giawhag kita, gidasig kita that we are to provoke one another to what? Unto love. In other words, you are not just called to exhort and encourage, you are even called to what? Spur one another, to stir up. Dili ngayon nga i-stir up na to nga masuko ang tao, dili i-stir up na to ang tao para nga mutubo siya o kung grabe ang iyang paghigugma sa usa-usa. Dili lang diha sa gugma, kung dili diha pagin sa mga maayong buhay. Look at verse 24. Let us consider one another to what? Provoke unto love and unto good works. Yes, that is our duty to one another. And how often must we do that to one another? Daily. We are to exhort one another. What else? Now come down to verse 25. Diha sa Hebrews chapter 10. Ingon diha, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is. Now, in biblical context, mga kaigsunan, the assembling of ourselves together simply means physically. Ang ato ang panagtigong o ang ato ang panagpundok. Apat ni ining sitwasyon nga atong giatubang karon, that we are being deprived of that possibility to come and assemble ourselves together physically. Yet, by God's grace, we are still able to assemble ourselves together in His presence. Nga pipila ka nato na din sa balay simbahan ang uban sa atong mga kaigsunan tuwa sa ilahang nga mga Pinoyanan. Sa unsa nga katuyuan that we can exhort one another. Mo kana gani nga gidasig ka diha. Kung gusto ka nga madasig nimo ang imong kaugalingon ang usag-usa diha sa inyo nga pagtuo sa pagdinasigay sa usag-usa, don't you forsake coming together. Don't you give in and don't you neglect, don't you ignore the assembling together of God's people. And that is what we usually do whenever we come for Lord's Day service, for prayer meetings, for fellowship meetings, for Bible studies. Indeed, these are avenues that the Lord has opened to us, where we can exhort one another, that we can build one another up in the faith, and we can provoke one another unto love and unto good works. And again, mas gikinahanglan nato, kung kinahanglan ni nato sa normal o regular nga mga adlaw sa itong kinabuhi, labaw nga gikinahanglan nato ni karon ining talagsaon kayo nga sitwasyon o kahintang sa atong mga kinabuhi. That even when we may not be able to assemble ourselves together the way we used to in this one place that the Lord has established, provided for us, yet we must see to it that as we gather together on our regular schedules, mga kaigsunan sama ini, while the rest of you are there in your homes and the few of us here in the church, let us see to it that we are able to assemble ourselves together in the presence of the Lord. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, and look at this, as the manner of some is. Meaning, niadtong panahon na sa pagsuwat panining mong suwat, diha na yung mga magtutuo, nga namugnaw na sa pagtuo, nga wa na magatambong sa mga panagtapo o panagtigong sa mga kaigsunan. In other words, it has already been the problem of some of the believers during that time that they have stopped attending and coming, meaning they have forsaken the attendance of the assembling together of God's people. Umo kini ang ako ang katuyuan nining kahaponon mga kaigsunan, nga dasigon ang usak-usak kanato, taliwa nining ato ang giatubang nga kahintang sitwasyon. Let us continue to encourage and exhort one another and to do it daily sa itong mga kinabuhi. Provoking one another unto love and to good works, and not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. And look at the remaining part of verse 25. But, can you see that but there? But, exhorting one another, ganit ingon pa gyud, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. As you see the day approaching, it refers to the coming day in the future. That particular day that we all look forward to. Kunya sa matag adlaw sa atong kinabuhi, we are actually being drawn closer and closer unto that day that is approaching. The more that we should encourage one another. Again, ilabi na niya ating atuang sitwasyon. Ilabi na niya ating atuang kahimtang o nahimutangan. Early this morning, I had opportunity to talk to Deacon Samuel, and we had indeed a good talk. You know, sa normal na mga okasyon, even long before this pandemic, we used to have these phone conversations, talking about the work of the ministry and other matters concerning the work and our situation sa simbahan o sa mga kaigsuunan. Apan, of late, of course, focus ato ang mga pakikistorya is more on sa sitwasyon nato o sa sitwasyon sa nila, sa ilaha nga mga giatubang nga mga burden, and in view of the burden also sa mga kaigsuunan sa simbahan. And of course, I am thankful to the Lord sa kaigayonan that I am able to talk to Him and that we can hear from one another. We can, in a way, exhort one another. Nga naman, as we have been told in this verse, it's one thing that we need. And it's one thing that we can do to one another. You know, mga kaigsunan, posible man nga imong dasigon ang imuhang kaugalingon, kanya madasig ka. Sure. But the exhortation here is not just to encourage yourself. While you can do so, while you, indeed it is true that you can encourage yourself in the Lord. Many characters in the Bible did it, particularly David, he encouraged himself in the Lord. But then again, the Bible here says that we are to encourage one another. In other words, there is that very special aspect in it nga dili nimo makuha kung ikaw ay magdasig sa imong kaugalingon. While it is possible nga madasig nimo imong kaugalingon, apan nagtuo ko nga naay mas dugang nga panalangin kung ikaw madasig sa imong isig ka igsuon. Exhorting one another so much the more as you see the day approaching. You know, mga kaigsunan, as we go through all these situations nga ito ang gituwag karon, daghan ang mga pangutana na dili gyapon nato mahatagan og husto ug sakto nga tubag apan ato ang dawaton nga naagi mga pangutana nga di na pud angayan pangitaan og tubag, but rather ato na itugyan sa Ginoo ug padayon nato nga isalig ang tanan ngadto sa atong Ginoo. Now, going back to our text, Hebrews chapter 3. Hebrews chapter 3. And looking at verse 13, we have looked at the duty and we have looked at the frequency, how often we are to do that duty to one another, exhort one another daily while it is today. Now, consider the consequence if we fail to do it. Consider the consequence if we fail to do it. Tanawa diha katapusang bahin. Lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Oftentimes, whenever we think of sin, we think of those obvious, visible sin that we commit. But you know what? one of the common sin that a believer would commit is doubt and unbelief. Oftentimes, mayroon ganita o sin, kanang yung sala, sin of commission. Sa ili mga kaisunan, that one of the most common sin that a believer commits is what? Not that sin of commission, obvious blatant sin, but that sin of doubt and unbelief. And you know, this is the sad consequence if we fail to do and fulfill our duty of exhorting one another. Look at the entire verse. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest or else any of you be hardened through deceitfulness of sin. Matag karon og unya makakita kita diha sa tuong mga kaigsunan sharing their burdens and cares, ang apo na sakit, ang inahan mo ni, ang igsuon, ang anak. You know mga kaigsunan, kini tanan nga mga sitwasyon, we need to really look at it with earnest desire in our heart to pray to the Lord and to encourage our brethren. Kaya nga naman, kaya you can never know kung unsay impact niini o pananglitan o may mga daotang may tabok sa ilang mga mahal sa kinabuhi. Rather nga ilahang madawat ang kabubuton, sometimes they can be bitter against God. Lord, nga naman, diin man ko nakuwang. Lord, why? Ganit mga kaigsunan, I can only thank the Lord nga niining panahuna. Yes, we have been praying and we have been praying and somehow the Lord has been gracious. Ganit kung mahinumdong ta nga nayusas atong igsuon nga nagpa-test sa COVID-19, yet it turned out negative. Praise God! Kay og pananglit og it-turn out positive, wa ko takibaw og how the brother would respond. It could strengthen his faith, yes. On the other hand, it can also break down his faith. What about? So sana to kay Sul, nga kanunay niya gipashare, there was a particular week and particular day nga ang iyang apo, ana-ana nga mga sakit. I can never tell how that grandmother would accept if indeed something bad happened sa iyang apo. Duha ra yun. It can either build up her faith or what? Break down his faith. The same is true to all of us. We really don't know how we would react and respond when bad things happen sa ato ang mga kinabuhi. Nga mo kana mga kaigsunan nga taliwa nining gitawag na to most trying times sa atong kinabuhi, the more we need to exhort one another daily, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. By our mutual exhortation and mutual edification, we are able to encourage and build one another up in the faith, preventing one another from falling into doubt and unbelief, preventing one another from experiencing discouragement. Yes, we are in these distressful times. Upon ayaw tuguti that this distressful time can cause you distress. We are in this most depressing time. But ayaw tuguti nga ang sitwasyon nga itong dito ba can cause you depression. We are in this discouraging time. Apan ayaw tuguti kining discouraging time nga mga discourage kanino. Nakuha na itong iso. Wa na tayo mahimo nini. We are in this together. Apan, one thing we can do is we are able to encourage one another in the midst of this distressful time, in this most difficult time, and in this most depressing time, and even in this most discouraging time. And by exhorting one another and building one another up, we are able to strengthen one another in the faith, and preventing one another from falling into doubt and unbelief. Think about it, mga kaibigan. Kinsa ba ka nato karon? Calculate, ngayon anak kang kalipod that you don't need encouragement from others. Take heed of this duty. Consider the frequency of this duty. Most of all, think of the utter consequence if we fail to do that duty. Any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Yes, sin is deceitful. You know how deceitful sin is? The moment you doubt, sa panahon nga you doubted God, you never have thought that that act of doubting God is sin. That is how deceitful sin is. The moment you question God's working, the moment you question God's dealing, you never have thought nga kanang imong pag-question, kanang imong pag-pangtanaw, kanang imong pagduha-duha, kanang pag, you know, the thought of questioning God's working and dealing with you, you never have thought about it as sin. And that is how deceitful sin is. Unless somebody that is slightly mature than you can tell you, hindi na mauhis on. I hope na diya ka rin higmat na bitaw no? You know, mga kaibigan, kining nga duty is our duty to one another. It's not just the pastor's duty to the church, nor it is the elder's duty to the rest of the church, nor the deacon's duty. It's our duty to one another. Inasmuch that I would exhort you, please know and understand this, that you also can do the exhorting nani ka. Doing so, we are building one another up in the faith, especially in these most difficult times. You know, mga kaibigan, as we take heed of this exhortation before us, huwag na kung ato abang sukumon o kamalandungan ang ato ang sitwasyon karon. Nga kung kini, ikinahanglan nato o kini importante alam ka nato sa normal na mga sitwasyon sa itong kinabuhi. Sayri mga sa ignoran nga mas labaw nga importante nga ato kining pagabuhaton ni ining oras o panahon nga atong giatubang. For we are in such a time that we are to take heed of this exhortation and to really take heed of it seriously. Ayaw tuguti nga ako sa kaadlaw mo labay as imong kinabuhi without you able to encourage another. Remember the frequency? But exhort one another what? Daily. You know mga kaibigan, like even in this group messaging, and so, dili mo ko, na, huwag maging siguro, bisag usa na ito, nga tanong na lang, sige, apong bitaw diha, anak ato ang group messaging, nga mag-ihap, o kinsa na ni, nakakita. Now and then, makalantaw, kunyaglantaw na ko, like last night, I was fast asleep upon sa diyang nakamata ko, I chanced to see one sister around past 10 in the evening. One sister sharing, please pray for me, I'm having difficulty in sleeping. Kaya murag, gahamos ko na siya, some problem with sa iyang breathing, difficulty in breathing. You know, mga kaibigan, you can just imagine, kung ikaw na igsuon na, unya, no one bothered to just reply na, we are praying, or thank you for sharing, we will pray. I'm sure nga, ma-appreciate yun niya nga sa iyahan nga pag-share niya na ay isang nakatubag lang nga, yes, we thank you for sharing, we will pray, or we are praying for you. Ako na itong mga kaibigan, nga sa inyo ang pagpasa niya. Now, if you are really mindful and conscious of this duty to one another, by simply making that reply, and really sincere in your reply that you will indeed pray, dako kay nag-impact o epekto sa hintungdan. Better yet, if you are able, give them a call. Better yet, if you are able, share a verse. Ano man? Kaya kung kini importante ka na to sa normal sa dagan nga panahon, mas labaw importante ni panahon nga itong iatubang. Kaya nga naman, you just don't know how this pandemic has impacted people. Yes, what I can say nga sa adunay uban ka na to nga naligod o nadasig diya sa pagtuo, pagpangalaga sa Ginoo. But I cannot deny the fact that there are those nga ang epekto sa pandemic diha nila murag namugnaw, nangaluya, and they seem to be doubting God's calling upon their lives. And as a pastor, I cannot afford. I would take time to really encourage, and I would take time to pray and convince these people na ayaw. Remember, faithful is He that what? That calleth you. Lest any of you be hardened by the what? Deceitfulness of sin. And so, mga kaisun, having considered this message with you tonight, I pray that we will take it really and commit ourselves to it, the duty in which we are exhorted, and that is to exhort one another, and the frequency that we are to do it to one another. Be mindful of the sad consequences should we fail to do our duty. And so, mga kaigsunan, may we all do our duty and fulfill this duty to one another with all diligence, as it is our solemn duty to one another. Magkakot ang mga kaigsunan.